Hey Matt, you have an interesting video there. You touch on kind of the flip side to what I'm talking about when I talk about time. The part that I don't get to talk about as much, but like I talk about time being fluid because there is no point that equals 2 o'clock. There's only the time that takes place between 2 o'clock and 2:01. But in the same way, I believe that the physical dimensions are fluid as well, so that there is no real smallest part. What we see as the smallest part, I think, are constantly being split into smaller and smaller parts. Um, and kind of the same way that the Big Bang works theoretically, in that there's a single dense matter that didn't move, and it was when part of it began to move differently than the other part that time began. And so, yeah, in pretty much the same way, I think that um, that collisions are still taking place. They're just getting smaller and smaller, and so the smaller we look, the smaller things we're going to find because smaller things are constantly being created. But at the same time, ultimately, at its smallest part, it's all going to be connected, and it's all one big blob of goo. Um, but when demarcating between one object and another, we can't just look at the matter, because all the matter, when we break it down, ultimately is going to look the same. But if we look at the movements that the matter takes, and the patterns of movements that it takes, and how it interacts with its surroundings, and then we can start to actually differentiate between different objects. And to a certain extent, it's always going to be arbitrary, because like we can see that one thing's moving this way and another thing's moving this way, but there's still going to be that area in between that's connected. So there's always going to be a gray area there. So I guess the goal is to try to get that gray area as small as possible, but at some point we are going to have to draw lines if we want to talk about things in any rational sort of way. And so, but that's the whole point of classifications. But that being said, organic matter and inorganic matter can still be seen as different things. If you don't focus on the part that don't focus on where one ends and the other begins, but focus on the center of what we consider that object, you can see that it's moving in a different pattern. So it's a bit tough to classify at the smallest level where the difference in movement takes place exactly, but we can still see that different movements are taking place. But you said they're not separate bodies; they're systems of interaction, and that's exactly it. We don't define the bodies by the physical material alone, but by the interactions that are associated with them. We're still drawing arbitrary lines, but looking at movement is the only possible way to get any sort of semblance of accuracy. You said not only is the cosmos whole, but it's constantly developing. Um, and that's the way I think it appears, but I think the way it's actually working is kind of in the opposite. I think it makes more sense to see it as it's deteriorating. The universe is constantly expanding, both on the macro scale and on the quantum scale. Looking at the universe as a single whole and differentiating objects within it as different sorts of movements and interactions, it makes sense to think that the movements themselves are continually getting smaller as I guess the goo continually is interacting with itself on smaller and smaller scale, and so new smaller objects are constantly being created and then moving apart from each other. Um, And so the smallest object in his existence is constantly being replaced by something smaller, kind of like a ripple on water if there was no resistance to end the cycle. A potential infinity of tinier and tinier things which need fancier and fancier microscopes to see. But what we see is organization, looking purely at the inorganic universe for the moment. Orbits, solar systems, essentially gravity. All that leads to is more explosions to break the matter apart, or implosions which gather the matter into single points which then move as one, and so can be seen as single objects, which can't be spread further. And I mean, that's just what happens when you knock a bunch of pool balls around, and some of those pool balls happen to have significant gravitational pulls. Personally, I don't see much organization about that. It's just a bunch of different sized objects moving around, or differently shaped pieces of the same puzzle interacting with each other. The holarchy I haven't studied, so I can't disagree with it from what I've heard, and it would be growing in complexity, but that wouldn't be the result of any sort of organization, I don't think. It would be the result of the continual introduction of new parts which move in different ways, and so the interaction that takes place within those grows exponentially as time goes on. Organic matter, on the other hand, does organize, and that's why I see the two as being separate. It's still part of the goo, but it's separate in the sense that, like my thumbnail and my liver are parts of me, but they're completely different parts of me which do different things in different ways. And yes, all goo must have the potential to have the ability to sense, but it doesn't necessarily follow that they actualize that potential. All trees have the potential to become cuckoo clocks, but some trees never get cut down. I'll agree that it's possible for inorganic matter to gain the ability to sense if it's altered in the right way, just as organic matter can lose it if it dies, but there's no reason to believe that that sensation is an intrinsic property of the universe itself, rather than the result of the movements that part of the universe is making. And I think that explains a bit why you can. I would view organic matter as being able to sense, and inorganic matter as not being able to sense, because organic matter, it moves differently in that it actually moves towards a goal. It's not entirely reactionary. Well, it's reactionary, but in a different way. It is able to move itself. And I think that that's what causes the ability to sense, is the ability to move, or could even be the other way around. The ability to move comes from the ability to sense. So without sensation, we can't move ourselves, and so there's no real reason to say that a rock which doesn't move itself can sense, because there's no evidence of it. At the molecular level, like the movement all comes down to binary good and bad, move in the goodest direction, but it's still moving in that direction. Sensation is what separates an object from which can move from one that can't. If a person lost their ability to feel their legs, they won't be able to move them. So it makes no sense to say that materials which can't move still have some form of sensation. On another subject, real quick, it seems like you see time as an actual infinite set, and most of what I read, and the one prof that I talked to about the subject, claimed that that's not possible. So if that is your point of view, I'm curious to hear your reasonings behind that. So yeah, looking forward to a response.